I don't know that they can defend well enough for a 6-game run to get it done.
Well, we just got our cold open, so that's the good news.
Welcome into another week on the D3 Datacast. I'm Zach Snyder, joined by my co-host Matt Snyder. We've had another great, exciting week of Division III basketball. How you feeling?
It's every single week has been great. Fantastic finishes. Waiting for UAA games to finish in overtime before we can record this. We're doing it a little bit early because we're trying to get Super Bowl stuff. And what a great Super Bowl it was. The commercials were great. The halftime was great. The ending of the game, absolutely, Zach. I cannot describe to you how that's indescribable moments we've had right there.
Who could have seen that coming?
But now that football season is fully over, it's Division III basketball all the way. So I'm expecting all the major news networks to be fully on board with D3 basketball, just like we are and just like our viewers are.
We're coming off a week where we've seen our first set of NPI rankings officially released by the NCAA. So we're going to dive in deeper into NPI this episode. Going to give a little bit of a refresher of a primer that we gave last season this time. But Matt, I'm sure there's new fans, people who maybe weren't as up to date on NPI over the course of last season, right? So it's a good time just to maybe back to some basics, educate potentially a new audience, give a refresher for some people who may be new to it, and kind of use some examples of some things we saw in that first set of rankings that might lead to some interesting topics, kind of show maybe how some teams have taken different paths to about the same place, right? And that gives us some opportunities to really talk about NPI and how it works
Yeah.
and how it all leads to that, basically just that one number that we see that determines where everyone is ranked.
And we'll take a little bit of a look at where the bubble's at as well as we sit here on February 8th.
Absolutely, because each set of rankings is just a snapshot in time. And while it might be interesting to see where everyone ranks as of games played to that date, ultimately it's about where it's going, where it is at the end of the season, right? So we don't have to necessarily wait to see exactly how that plays out. We have some tools that, of course, we've been using at d3datacast.com for everyone to see how that bubble picture is developing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as the show goes on. But let's get into this episode. Start off with our first segment of the show, a familiar one at this point for this season. Matt, it's our 4-point play where we use the 4 points of the compass to look around the Division III basketball landscape, talk about the things that caught our eye or have been on our mind over the past week as we've observed the Division III basketball landscape. So kick us off, as you do each week, with that first compass point in the North.
Yeah, Zach. University of Chicago took Emory on the road to overtime on Sunday afternoon. They ultimately lost by 3 points. That's a game that finished about 5 minutes ago as we record here. Emory still has a game in hand. They have to play a postponed game against Carnegie Mellon during kind of ice storms a few weeks ago, so they haven't played the same number of games. So Chicago is 7-2, Emory right behind at 6-2 right now. The two teams have split, I believe, the season series. Going to be a great finish in a great conference. Probably it's coming down to these two teams, but you never really know in the UAA. But right now, I think it's safe to say that Chicago and Emory are two of the best teams in the country. Whether or not one is actually number one, I think they've both now spent time there this season at number one. Not really sure, but probably both safely top five at this point, in my opinion. I haven't deep dived into my ballot yet since we're doing this a little bit early, but I think two favorites to go deep in the NCAA tournament. Great league, two great teams. Fun to see them play in overtime on Sunday.
And it is looking more and more like a two-team race, especially as we've seen Wash U take a loss on Sunday
Yeah.
against Rochester. Brandeis was kind of in that mix at this point in the season. They took a loss at Case Western Reserve. So, hey, look, we've seen it doesn't take much. It's not surprising necessarily to see someone go 0-2 on a UAA weekend. So a lot can change very quickly. But through one turn plus a weekend through UAA play, it does look like that two-team race between Chicago and Emory. Matt, my play here in the North is going to be Jalen Overway. Going to put his picture up on the screen here. In the first meeting between Calvin and Kalamazoo, Jalen went a perfect 10 for 10 from the field. Of course, the Knights played Kalamazoo in their home meeting this past weekend, and Jalen made his first 11 shots this time around against Kalamazoo. And with one of those being a three-pointer, Matt, that means through his first 21 field goal attempts against Kalamazoo on the season, Overway had an effective field goal percentage of 102.4%, right? So better than perfect from the field in terms of effective field goal percentage. Unfortunately, he did add one more field goal attempt before the game, or before he was, removed from what was a blowout game. It was a missed three-pointer. So I guess he'll have to settle for, finishing with a 95.5 shooting percentage with an effective field goal percentage against Kalamazoo of 97.7% while averaging 27 points per game in those two meetings. But, that's not so bad.
Yeah, a lot of teams have had a difficulty stopping Jalen Overway, not just this year, but in his other previous two seasons as well. But yeah, for Kalamazoo, he's really showed up against the Hornets this year. Like you said, not really missing any shots while the games have been in doubt. Later on, he did miss a 3-point attempt. So yeah, I guess buoy for him. But 95% will have to settle for that.
Not too bad. All right, let's look east. What do you got for us when you're looking east this past week?
Yeah, looking at Western Connecticut, who beat UMass Boston in overtime this past week. I think it was Wednesday to pull within a half a game of the Beacons in the Little East standings. The win was the 13th in the last 14 games for a WestCon team that started Little East play 0-2. They're now 9-3 in the league, and they're threatening UMass Boston, who sits just above them at 10-3. WestCon, though, has actually won both head-to-head meetings, so they still sit well from that standpoint. Really tough game ahead for Western Connecticut. This next Saturday, they're playing up at Keene State. That's always a difficult game. Keene State themselves are trying to hang in the Little East Conference race, so it's going to be massive for both of those two teams trying to track down Mass Boston. So really interested to see what happens up here down the stretch in the LEC.
Yeah, that LAC race is one we've talked about a few times, and not what we're used to seeing with Keene State. Adjusting to some roster turnover, losing some of the great players they've had over the last couple of years. But really, it's not just about that, but just maybe the top of the Little East being as good as it's ever been. So quite a race to watch down the stretch there. In the East, Matt, let's talk about Williams. They're not a team that we've talked about, which is kind of crazy for people who have followed Division III basketball for a long time. Like Williams not really being on the radar just is crazy. And unfortunately, here we're talking about them for not so good reasons. They had a rough trip to Maine this past weekend, losing games at Colby and Bowdoin. And those losses dropped the East to an 0-8 conference record and leaves just one more NESCAC weekend to avoid going winless in conference play. This is a program that's just kind of unfathomable to think that that's a possibility. They do have a home game against Hamilton on Friday, which looks like their best opportunity to get off the schneid. And if that doesn't happen, Matt, though, that sets up a huge one as the Eafs will have to face rival Amherst. The Mammoths come to town looking, they'd be in the position to, not only finish off a season sweep, but also score some additional jollies if it means clinching a winless conference record for their rivals. Um, it's just not one of those things we're used to seeing with Williams at 0-8 in the standings. Of course, we talked earlier in the season about where Worcester is in the NCAA race. Is another one of those where it's just a program name in a place you're just
Yeah.
not used to seeing.
I mean, it's a tough conference though. We talk all the time about how the NESCAC is one of the best conferences in the country. I just pulled up the efficiency ratings as you were talking. Williams is now 11-11 overall in the season, but still number 105 in the efficiency ratings because they play a tough schedule. So almost a top 25% team, even though 0-8 in conference. I think it's a little bit of the nature of the league, a little bit of the Williams not really being where we saw them, several years ago.
It's similar to like being at the bottom of a UAA. You might be last place UAA, but in the grand scheme of things, you could still be a pretty good team. It's
Yeah,
just you got to be a little bit better than pretty good to avoid getting
sure.
beaten up in certain leagues. All right, halfway home here, Matt. Let's look south. What caught your eye there?
Yeah, Rhodes picked up a massive 1-point road win over Trinity, Texas on Saturday to give the Lynx the season sweep over the Trinity Tigers. They were down by 2, but sophomore guard Phil Dotson hit a 3-pointer with about 30 seconds left to play. The Rhodes defense held tall down the stretch to secure the victory. With 4 games remaining for Rhodes and 3 for Trinity, they both play on Sunday here. The 2-0 sweep, though, could loom very large when it comes to SAA position and seeding. It looked, as we left the Great Lakes Invitational, Trinity looked fantastic there. Looked like Trinity might just be the best team in the SAA, but Rhodes has really played strong. That 2-0 is so massive, getting that 1-point win on the road. Super fantastic from Rhodes. And now they're getting themselves in position. They could grab that AQ, and if not, maybe be in that large bid position here. Probably still need to keep winning, but it's going to be interesting to see where Rhodes lands.
Yeah, they got that first game against Trinity at home, and I think maybe, it was like, okay, Yeah, it was it's been a cute story, good for them, they got that one, but it was at home. Now they've taken that road trip to San Antonio and come away with another win, so, again, if they can keep it going, the SAA tourney is gonna look like, a pretty interesting one and definitely upsetting any expectations some people might have had with Trinity, Texas moving to the SAA that they were just gonna go in there and dominate right from the jump. For me in the South, Matt, Guilford's 128-67 blowout win over Randolph last week, had an eye-popping final score, but it was, the halftime score that really raised my eyebrow even more. The Quakers took a 51-point lead into the break at 80-29. Guilford forced 21 first half turnovers, including 17 steals, leading to 44 points off turnovers while only turning it over once themselves. Tell you what, that's not bad for one half of work.
Yeah, they've brought some excitement as a change of pace into the ODAC this year. I'm looking for Guilford. Um, not that this season is over for them by any stretch of the imagination, but building into next year's as they kind of run this style now, a new coach this season, to see where they go in the ODAC. I think that'd be really interesting to see.
Yeah, a lot of fun to watch. As Guilford was one of the slowest tempo teams a
Yeah.
year ago, and definitely changing, from one end of the spectrum to the other here. All right, let's finish up with our play in the West.
Yeah, Whitworth maybe can clinch the Northwest Conference this week. They were 2-0 last week with wins over Whitman and Linfield. The Pirates now maintain a 3-game lead over second place Puget Sound. Only 4 games left to play. Those two teams will finish the regular season against each other on February 21. But Whitworth, I think, is going to have plenty of opportunities to have that title wrapped up by then. They only need 2 wins or maybe a win and a Puget Sound loss to clinch the #1 seed. Whitworth hosts Lewis and Clark on Friday. If they win that one, they could clinch at least a share of the Northwest Conference Championship. And then they turn around the next day on Saturday and host George Fox. They could maybe win it outright that day, cut down the nets. I think Whitworth is still maybe only on the the fringes of bubble contention for the national tournament. So they're probably going to have to win the Northwest Conference AQ to keep themselves alive for the tournament. But, keep winning and we'll see what happens. I think, to me, it feels like the bubble's getting a little soft right now. So maybe teams like Whitworth find themselves in bubble position by the end of the year.
And should have a good chance to win that one, Matt, because uh, they've not gotten through unscathed, but seem to be taking care of business. And some of these games just aren't particularly competitive, right? They've got 2 blowout wins over rival Whitman. So we'll see what happens. Tourney time is always unpredictable, but this should be one that Whitworth, should be heavy favorites, right? So go into it, win the darn thing. Don't even have to worry about what the bubble picture might look at, right?
Yeah.
We'll wrap up here with a tough luck loss for UW Stout. Losing on a bubble buzzer beater always hurts, but it had to have hurt even more for UW Stout in their loss to UW Whitewater on a deep 3 that banked off the backboard, rattled around before falling. Ouch, Matt. That's all I can really say from the WIAC network. Take a look at this one.
UTEC's free throws kind of miss, so now it doesn't matter. Now a 3 could win it here for Whitewater. A 2 would tie it. Here's Burgess with 5, with 4. Burgess spinning. Burgess with a tough play, lays it off for the win. It is in! Brock Marino banks it in for the win, and Whitewater comes away with a 78-77 win over the Blue Devils.
Yeah, Zach, as a fan, nothing kind of bothers me more than the opposing team banking in a three-pointer, but a shot in that situation that just kind of rattles and falls. That's devastating. That's tough. So unfortunate there for Stout to lose that game.
I've been known to throw back my head with an eye roll watching games and seeing that, a banked 3 go in. I can only imagine if it was in that kind of situation where it's the actual literal difference between losing and winning on the final shot like that. Tough stuff. But hey, Whitewater got the shot up. It went down. They get the win. It's not easy to do in the WIAC, right? That's been a bloodbath. And that kind of keeps them in what right now is looking like a 5-team race.
Yeah, put yourself in position to win. And it's not like the first time that Whitewater's won on a buzzer. I remember at Hope, they scored 2 3-pointers in like the final 10 seconds or something like that to win a game. So, hey, you put yourself in a position to get close, and sometimes good things happen.
That's right. Matt, you mentioned that we're recording a little bit on the early side compared to what we normally do. You don't have a completed top 25 ballot, but before we move into our main topic here, diving into some of the NPI topics, let's talk just kind of generally about the top 25 picture, maybe some high level thoughts as you look later on to sit down and put together your final ballot. Let's just start. We've seen a lot of turnover. Number one, uh, in the last couple weeks. Number one went down again. I know they weren't necessarily your number one on your ballot, but U Chicago was this past week in the poll. They lose an overtime game at Emory, which, hey, maybe doesn't really say a whole lot, right? That you can't really knock a team for an overtime loss on the road to Emory. But as you're sitting down, any thoughts? Just maybe filling in that first team on your ballot this week.
Yeah, I was still going with Trinity even as of last week. So I think I'm going to go back there again. I was thinking, though, on Sunday mid afternoon, Chicago's locked in this tight game with Emory, just starting to think about my ballot. I would have strongly considered Chicago at number one, maybe pulled the trigger on that had they gone and beaten Emory. That would have been, I think, 2-0 for them against Emory. Would have been a really, really good weekend. Not that it was a terrible weekend, but would have been a really, really good weekend. I think that would have launched Chicago into number one for me. As it is now, I'm not sure where they're going to be. Is that going to be 2 or 3? Probably somewhere in there. I mentioned in the 4-point play, I think Emory and Chicago are still both top 5 teams for me, so I'll have to see where they slot in. But this game, an overtime game on the road for Emory and Chicago, it's kind of 2 really good teams playing up to expectations. So, they're not gonna. It's not going to drop the loser of the game too far.
Any other just kind of thoughts off the top of your head that you feel like you're going to really need to take a look at, or just kind of directions you're going to go right off the bat when you sit down to go put together the ballot this week?
Yeah, not as many overall losses as there were last week, but still, a significant number. There were also a lot of Sunday games. So as of this point that we record, I have not assessed those teams really at all. An interesting one for me to look at, though, will be Mary Washington, who did take 2 losses this week,
Yeah.
but those were at Christopher Newport and at Randolph-Macon. They did lose both of those games by about 10, so it's not like they were losses. They weren't like right there, but they were convincing losses, I guess. So,
Well,
but against 2 good teams, so I'm gonna have to figure out where am I gonna put Mary Washington. They were just number 2 on my ballot, and I think 2 in the national poll. So they won't stay there, but how far are they gonna fall after taking those 2 losses? Not quite sure yet.
well, and the other way, it was a week set up for them with everything going on over the last couple of weeks in the overall picture, that they could have staked a claim to the number one
Yeah,
spot
right.
themselves had they gone 2-0. But like you said, not terrible losses, tough opponents, but the kind of week that had it gone the other direction for them, I think they're a team that would have gotten a lot of looks from a lot of people for that number one spot. Now it's like maybe they're more like a number 10,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. They could fit somewhere, almost anywhere from that 4 to 10 spot. I'm just kind of picking those kind of at random a little bit, but they should slot in there somewhere maybe, and I'll have to figure out exactly where that is.
Matt, let's talk about Randolph-Macon here, because that was one of those losses that Mary Washington took. I was very curious as I was watching that game with that margin, being in that double-digit range. I was wondering if maybe for the Sunday run of the efficiency ratings, if they would overtake Trinity, and they came up just short. I believe 0.6 of a point of efficiency margin away from taking over Trinity in the number one in our D3 Datacast computer ratings. Is that another one of those kind of top, sure top 5 teams for you? As you've already mentioned Chicago, you've already mentioned Emory. Trinity was your number one, and I don't
Yeah.
think necessarily had any reason this past week for you to move off of that. Is that another one that's like, you know, if so, that's like kind of like 4 of your
Yeah.
5 locked into the top 5 there.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking I'm running out of surefire top 5 spots because there's only 5, but Randolph-Macon is probably in that mix too. I don't know that I would have considered them as number 1, but they have, I think, 2 losses, maybe both by 2 points, at Virginia Wesleyan, at Averett. The Averett one, is not great, but that was on that buzzer beater. That was kind of crazy shot, so maybe a game that they should have won. I think Randolph-Macon is definitely in that mix, that top 5. I would be surprised if they did not end up in the top 5 for me. And in fact, they were last week. I had them at 4, so that feels like their floor after beating Hampton-Sydney and Mary Washington this week. It feels like no way I would move them down.
All right, so let's talk NPI. We saw official numbers this past week. Of course, official doesn't always mean correct. We did note that there were a number of instances in which teams within a same conference played non-conference games against each other, and because men's basketball uses a different weighting for non-conference games and conference games, um, those should be handled differently in the NPI calculations. It seems in any instance that I look through, all of those games that should have been non-conference games were incorrectly counted as conference games, right? So as we were looking into some of those differences of why, a number that we had on our site didn't necessarily match the official numbers, there were a number of those kinds of cases where we were comfortable with what we were showing, and we did receive confirmation that there is no change in approach, right? So it seems everything from our understanding was correct in that those should be weighted as non-conference games. So we'll definitely be looking with interest to see if those corrections have been made, as we expect another batch of official NPI numbers coming out this week. Uh, yeah, so that's just something to watch. We're updating those numbers daily at d3datacast.com/NPI. At this point in the season, the NCAA has started releasing them officially, but just kind of on a weekly cadence. That will increase later on. But let's talk more about NPI, Matt, as now that they're officially putting out numbers there, right? So more and more interest, and we're getting closer to the end of the season, so these numbers mean more, greater emphasis on them just in terms of how it's shaping the overall picture. So let's talk about it, starting with the real basics, kind of the basic formula framework for how NPI works.
Right, because we're at the time of the year where if you're new to Division III basketball and you're starting to see these NPI numbers come out, like what does this mean? This is the NCAA's tournament selection and seeding metric for the national tournament. So what is NPI? It's a team's winning percentage times the winning percentage dial. That's something that could be adjusted every few years if the national committee wanted to, plus the opponent's NPI rating, which is your team's strength of schedule times a dial plus a quality win bonus, and that equals NPI. Now, NPI is an input into everyone else's NPI that you've played, right? Their opponent's NPI. So this is an iterative process. You kind of do these calculations once, take the numbers, plug it back in for every other team on everyone's schedule, run it again. You do that 70, 80 times, the numbers start stabilizing, and then that's your NPI value once they start changing. NPI usually reports, or the NCAA reports it out to 3 decimals, and we've found large matching with our approach in that. So this is all NPI is. This is the framework: winning percentage, strength of schedule, quality win bonus, NPI, right? That's what it is.
So it's a basic framework. You talked about the dials, so let's talk a little bit more specifically about how that works for men's basketball. So those dials are set to a balance equaling 100 between winning percentage and strength of schedule. The men's basketball committee a couple years ago, when NPI was adopted, chose those initial dial settings to be 25-75, split between winning percentage and strength of schedule.
Yep. So if you win a game, that's 100 times 0.25. That's 25 for that little chunk. Plus we talked about the strength of schedule component being the opponent's NPI, and you multiply that by 75%. And then you get a quality win bonus if a team is good, right, above a certain threshold. So that threshold starts at 53 for men's basketball. You can see the dials on there. So if a team is at 54, you get 54 minus 53, that's 1. And then you multiply that times 0.667, and that would be that game's quality win bonus. And that happens for every game on every team's schedule, and that's how NPI is calculated.
So let's take a look at an example of that. This would be based on after you run it, and all those numbers stabilize, right? So you can work it out like this, right? So let's say you played an opponent who has an NPI of 59. If you win that game, of course, the 100 for the winning percentage times 0.25. Plus 59, right? The opponent's NPI times 0.75 for that strength of schedule component. And 59 is greater than 53. So you have the 59 minus the quality win baseline of 53 times the QWB multiplier, which the men's basketball committee set at 0.667, right? Yeah, you got that iterative process, but ultimately it's a pretty simple formula, right? So that comes out to 73.252 for a game that you win against a team that has an NPI of 59. So you play that team, you win, a 73.252, kind of game NPI number goes on your resume. Anyone else who has beaten that team has that same number on their resume. Now, what happens if you played that team with an NPI of 59 and you lost? Of course, that winning percentage for a loss is 0 times the 0.25 plus 59 times 0.75 for the strength of schedule factor. There's no quality win bonus because you did not win. And so that comes out to a game NPI value of 44.25. So that's the kind of the risk reward of playing a team that has an NPI value of 59. If you win, your resume is going to get credited with a 73.252 number. If you lose, you're gonna get hit with a 44.25 number on your NPI.
Yeah. And you can see, right, the strength of schedule component, the opponent's NPI is the same in both instances. You just don't get the winning percentage, obviously, and you don't get the quality win bonus, obviously. So if you want to do a quick rule of thumb for the difference between winning and losing, that's 25 points, right? Because that's 100 times 0.25 plus a few points for quality win bonus. So you can see the difference here in these two teams is about 29 points. That's 25 plus about 4 points of quality win bonus. That's just a quick rule of thumb of, hey, if we won this game instead of losing or we lost instead of winning, use 25 points or so for that one game, and that would kind of get you there.
And then the other thing to discuss here, especially because we've already made reference to it in terms of the error that is present in the official release that was this past week, that has to do with the home away, win-loss bonus. So this is one of the things that can be kind of difficult to understand about NPI is going through that example. That is a one game, right? And your overall NPI number is a weighted average of all of those individual game NPIs. And it's a weighted average because one game doesn't necessarily equal one game, right? So in the non-conference, a home loss is weighted at 1.2, a home win is weighted at 0.8. A road win would be weighted at 1.2. A road loss would be weighted at 0.8. And then the same applies for a conference game. It's just a little bit less extreme, right? So if you win a conference game at home, that would be weighted as a 0.9. If you lose on the road, that would also be a 0.9. If you win on the road, it's a 1.1. And if you lose at home, that'd be weighted as a 1.1 game, right? So the amount of credit you get on a game basis, is the same based on the calculation, the formula below. But as it goes into that total overall NPI, the weighting of that particular game can be a little bit different depending on the location and the result. And of course, any neutral game is just a 1.0, 1.0.
Yeah. Yep. And one other question then on the weightings that we always get, that doesn't make the game look easier or harder. It just carries more weight in your schedule. So that win that you see on the screen of 73.2, if that was a road conference game, that would be 1.1 times that number. But then also in your denominator, your total adjusted games played would get 1.1 games in there as well. So in a one game standpoint, if you viewed it as one game, that number gets multiplied by 1.1 and divided by 1.1. But then when you take a whole season approach, each game gets weighted by its multiplier value, but then all of those multiplier values go in the denominator as well. It's cool to talk about math on podcasts.
Yeah, with slides and graphs. Okay, let's talk about women's basketball here because as their own committee, the women's basketball committee made some different choices, not drastically different necessarily, a little bit of a different split between winning percentage and strength of schedule, a little bit heavier actually on the strength of schedule side, winning percentage at 20, strength of schedule at 80. They at this point have not had any sort of differentiation between home and away. So all games are just weighted as a 1.0, right? In women's basketball NPI, then a game is a game. It doesn't matter if it's in conference, out of conference, home, road, just a game is a game. Slightly different quality of win bonus baseline of 54, the same multiplier at 0.667, right? So how that plays out, let's take that same, same example, playing an opponent with an NPI of 59. If you win that game, that's a 100 winning percentage, this time times the 0.2 because the dial setting is slightly different, plus the 59 times 0.8. And the quality win bonus is a little bit different because it's the 59 minus 54 as the baseline instead of 53 times the same multiplier of 0.667. So in women's basketball, beating a team with an NPI of 59 leads to a 70.535 on a team's resume, and then losing that game, same thing, except for you just replace that 100% winning percentage with a 0, take away the quality win bonus, that leads to a 47.2 that hits that team's resume in a loss.
Yeah, so overall very similar, just the different weightings, 20/80 instead of 25/75. There's no multipliers for home away, no difference in conference non-conference, and then the quality win bonus base value is just a little bit higher. So overall, we see that there's a little bit less of a difference between winning a game and losing a game here in women's basketball. There's a little bit more of the emphasis on how strong was the team that you played. So that's a little bit of a difference there.
So it's important to point out that it is quite similar, but some different choices were made. And so you can't necessarily look at, oh, the number one seed in men's basketball had this as their NPI
Yeah,
number, and the number one seed in women's basketball had this as their NPI number, right? Because they're operating under
yeah,
the same framework, but kind of different choices in terms of how those calculations play out. So there really isn't any correlation to be made based on
the
the
number.
NPI
Yeah,
score, right, that you might see associated with a men's basketball team in relation to a women's basketball team.
yep.
All right, so let's that's kind of how it works. So let's look to history, or history as it is, because we've only had 1 year actually under NPI. But Matt, going back a year ago, we were drawing on the previous 3 years of results, which is what the committees were looking at when they were trying to develop their initial dial settings, right? So we have that kind of history, even though it didn't officially play out under NPI. All you need is some dial settings and a set of results, and you can run NPI to see kind of what would have happened, right? And so what we did was was do that, replicate it for ourselves, just to see, okay, what does a typical year look like? Can we set some expectations for, where you kind of want to be in terms of getting an at-large bid or for seeding, that sort of thing. And so what we found is that over the 3 years before NPI was adopted, and then that first year with NPI, is that typically in men's basketball, if you're looking to make the tournament as an at-large, you want to be kind of in that 60 to 61, a little bit better than 61 range in terms of your overall NPI. And then as last year played out, that's kind of what we saw, right? A little bit softer maybe. Gettysburg was the last team in at a 60.465 compared to how NPI would have played out the 2 years before that, where I actually needed to be above 60 to get in. And then on the women's basketball side, it's going to be more kind of in the 58, 59 range. And then UW Lacrosse last year, on the first year of NPI, was the last team in with a 57.82 NPI.
Yeah, interesting that last year we saw two numbers kind of on the lower side. Again, we only have now 4 years, real year of data. It was a little bit on the lower side. And I think it's interesting to me that these numbers can be variable a little bit, especially where I think the one that people are most interested in is always where that at-large bid cut line is going to be. But a lot of things affect that, most notably how many upsets are there in conference tournaments? That can really change the number, and it can change it in a hurry when you start kind of going up the pecking order. Once these typically would be really good teams, if they lose their conference tournament, that makes it a big deal to where that line ends up. So a couple of these years, we've had very few bid thieves. Like I think 21, 22, things went kind of as expected, and that number ends up being below 60 for men's basketball. Some of the, maybe 22, 23, I forget if that one had a bunch of bid thieves. One of these years had a bunch at the end. They end up above 61. So that can be variable. And that we don't even know that number until the last 2 days of the season, kind of when the Saturday and Sunday, a lot of the championship games happen. And you can really start seeing those numbers change in a hurry there.
So then using kind of the history and then the example calculation that we had before, I thought it'd be good to look through kind of like, what does it mean if you lost to the team with the highest NPI, for instance, right? Just to kind of maybe highlight that for tournament contending teams, there's really no such thing as a good loss. So let's talk about that. For men's basketball, if you kind of looking through history, that number one NPI team is kind of going to be in that, let's call it 75, right? So if 21, 22, it was maybe a little bit under 74. Some years it's maybe a little bit above 77, but let's just talk about it in terms of a 75. If you lose that game, apply your a 0 for the winning percentage, the 75 in for the opponent NPI. You get no quality win bonus because it's not a win, right? That's going to be a 56.25 that hits your overall NPI, right? And that's losing to the team with the highest highest overall NPI, right? You can't lose to anyone better than that, right? So that's kind of the most credit you can get, so to speak, for a loss. And that number is 56.25. If you're going to be a team looking to try to get in via at-large bid, and you know that your overall average needs to be above like a 61, well, 56.25 is not going to contribute positively to you finishing with an average above 61, right? So there's really no such thing as a good loss. Now, that's a loss that will hurt less than,
Yeah.
say, someone else who lost to team number 100 or 200 or 300, right? But that's not going to be a good loss that is in any way productive towards
Right.
you making an NCAA tournament.
Right. Basically, everyone's going to have losses. Maybe one or two teams is not going to have losses. So these would not devastate your resume, but there was some concern in the old SOS type system that you could play some games just to get them on your schedule and lose, and that would almost help your resume because it would make your strength of schedule number look better. There's no world really right now in which in NPI playing that game in men's or women's basketball and just losing, that's not actively helping you get into the tournament. Like we said, it's not devastating you. Some teams should obviously play these games and have the chance. It really helps you if you win. But it's not going to be like we just lost a bunch of really good games and that's how we got into the tournament. That's not how you get into the tournament.
And so using the same example for women's basketball, where kind of history tells us the number one team in NPI is going to be somewhere, around 69, that comes out to a 55.2 game NPI. So similarly, where, you're looking to be more in that, 59, 58, 59 range, 55.2 is not going to help get you there. It's not going to hurt you a ton, right? Because it's not far off of that, but it's not going to help you get to that number.
Yeah.
Other side of the coin, does this mean you can just play cupcakes and win? Well, history tells us that the team at the bottom of the NPI rankings is going to be something like 27 or so for both men's and women's basketball. So using that, if you beat, let's say, the last place team with an NPI of 27 on the men's side, that's going to be a 45.25 hitting your resume. On the women's side, that's going to be a 41.6. Again, it's always better to win than to lose, but just beating up on the teams at the very bottom of the NPI rankings, if you're putting a 45 and a 41.6 on your resume, that's not going to get you where you want to be in terms of being in tournament contention.
Yeah, and those numbers are a long way from that kind of 61 line, let's just say in men's basketball, or 59 line or so in women's basketball. You're not even really close to helping you. So these are two extremes. Just playing the toughest teams you can and saying, well, then we'll have a great strength of schedule, we'll get in. That doesn't work. Just playing the easiest teams and winning and saying, well, we'll just win a ton of games, that's how we're going to get in. That doesn't necessarily work either. I think there's a mix. You want a mix of quality and you want a mix of wins on your resume. So you have to find a way to get both, and quality wins, right? You get that quality win bonus that really helps you as well. So we're not talking about extreme resumes here. There are different paths in NPI to get there. I think there's not just one path. It's not just play like a lukewarm schedule. You can play really good schedules. You can play weaker schedules, but that gives you a different kind of margin for error in how many losses you can take in those games, of course, depending on your non-conference schedule and your conference schedule. But again, it's not just playing cupcakes and winning, and it's not just playing the hardest teams and getting an SOS boost and losing. Neither of those paths is the path to getting in.
So let's talk about some different paths, Matt, because there was a pretty interesting example with official numbers coming out. One of the teams that has generated a little bit of discussion online has been Endicott, because they are 19-1. And I think you see a team like Endicott and where they are in the NPI rankings and looking very competitive. And it seems like there's always two reactions to something like this. One says they're not getting enough credit for being 19-1, and another one that says they're getting too much credit because they haven't played anybody, right? So I think within NPI, there's room for reasonable discussion on either end of that spectrum, but we wanted to really take a look at a side-by-side comparison at involving Endicott, because they are a little bit more of an extreme resume on one side to some of the teams that that the final number looks very close, but kind of got there in a different way.
Yeah, so entering Sunday, these were the number 14 and number 15 teams in NPI. So quite strong in that kind of top 16 contention. Illinois Wesleyan was just ahead. And they're not the probably two most extreme examples of this. We just liked them because they were right next to each other.
Almost identical NPI scores.
Almost
there with
identical.
65.24 something.
Yes. And Illinois Wesleyan has 4 losses, and Endicott has just the 1. But if you can see here, we lined up how NPI sees each individual game. So you see their games that they've won and the games that they've lost. And then they're kind of color coded in that game NPI section. The green are games that NPI is counting positively for them. The red are losses that are obviously going to be hurting them. And then the grayed out are wins, but because of the minimum wins threshold, we're able to discount those from the calculation because they're wins that would be dragging down each team's NPI. But you can see right from the top and then at each subsequent line, Illinois Wesleyan has played more difficult opponents. So their best win is against University of Chicago, who gives a game NPI of about 88. Endicott has a really good win against Tufts, but not quite as good, and so they give an NPI of about 83. And then if you just kind of look down the line, every spot you go, the second best win, third best, fourth best, Illinois Wesleyan's opponents have given game NPIs of about 5, 6, 7 points higher than Endicott has all the way down the line. So you get to those 12.5 adjusted wins before we get to those grayed out games. And Illinois Wesleyan has a lot deeper of a well to pull from. All these games that are kind of quote unquote counting, I don't like that term, but let's just use it, are 67 and above for Illinois Wesleyan. Endicott, to get to 12.5 adjusted wins, has to count a portion of that Gordon game. I think it's 0.1 weighting of that game to get to 12.5, but that's only at 58. So they're counting a win. Even that Baruch game at 60 is probably not helping you get into the tournament actively, and they have to count that game. So there's some weaker games that are starting to show up on Endicott's counted games that Illinois Wesleyan, quite frankly, doesn't have. Even they're able to drop games, Kenyon, North Central, Illinois College. These are all games at 63 and 62 game NPIs, would be strong wins. That's what Illinois Wesleyan is able to use to overcome these losses. And there is, they could maybe even take another loss, and then you start replacing that with some pretty good wins. I think if we talked about each of these teams went out and lost their next game, you would likely see Endicott's NPI drop a lot further, regardless of who the actual opponent was, just because of what games are now being added back into the equation to kind of make up for a loss that's going to drag you down. Illinois Wesleyan would maybe be pulling in a couple of 63 type wins, whereas Endicott's next best wins are like 56, 57.
Yeah, right. So it just shows kind of different paths to getting to the same place. Now, the Tufts win is kind of validation for Endicott. You know, I don't think you want to just write off a strength of schedule or kind of make a low strength of schedule argument and then not give them credit for the Tufts win, right? That kind of validates that no, this team is legit. They are capable of winning this game. And then, you know, the Colby loss is kind of very much in range of like the Carthage and Elmhurst loss for Illinois Wesleyan. It's just Illinois Wesleyan has that stable of really strong wins that helps counteract the drag that those additional losses are having on their resume.
Yeah.
So Matt, another thing to talk about is you referenced that minimum win style. That's another big difference between the men's basketball settings and the women's basketball settings. In the men's side, once you get to 12.5 adjusted wins, if going above that, counting additional wins would be detrimental to your NPI, those can be excluded. On the women's side, it's 15 minimum wins, right? So if we just look at what that kind of would mean ballpark for Illinois Wesleyan, that means, you know, regardless of if they took another loss, whatever, just kind of adjusting from that 12.5 to the 15, well, then all of a sudden Illinois Wesleyan's adding, 63.6, 63.6, 62.85, whereas Endicott's adding 56.9, 56.8, 56.8. So again, this is, you see the impact of some of the dial choices here, where with the men's basketball side kind of limiting what we're looking at. Like, we want you to have a strong schedule, but as long as you've got at least 12.5 minimum wins that we look at, we don't really care maybe how soft it is after that. Whereas the women's side, they want to look a little bit deeper here. And if we're doing that with Illinois Wesleyan and Endicott, you would see that separation begin to develop as Illinois Wesleyan has better results beyond the current minimum win style for the men's basketball committee than Endicott does.
Yeah, and you're seeing it right about the point where Endicott starts dropping games. That's where the schedule for them starts to get pretty shallow. And I'll just call out these strength of schedule numbers that we looked up in the background, Zach. In the games that we're counting here, so that's the green wins and the red losses, Illinois Wesleyan strength of schedule is number 11 in the country. Endicott's is number 91 in the country. So not bad. That's still kind of an upper quartile schedule. If we consider all games, though, even the ones that were dropped out of the equation right now, Illinois Wesleyan stays pretty strong at number 17. Endicott goes all the way down to number 244. So it's that ability to drop the wins that aren't helping after 12 and a half adjusted wins that's really helping Endicott's schedule stay here. So they've really needed this kind of one loss resume. If they were 2 and 3 losses, we'd see a drastically lower resume. So they've needed to be here at one loss to be at the same point that where Illinois Wesleyan is at 4. So I don't necessarily think we're advocating that there needs to be a higher or lower minimum right now, but just that you take these two schedules and say, yes, Endicott's is softer than Illinois Wesleyan's. They also have 3 fewer losses, and that brings them up to the same spot. They've had a smaller margin for error, and so far they've walked that line. Another loss maybe would put them in precarious position when it comes to making the tournament. 2 certainly would. For Illinois Wesleyan, another loss maybe isn't that impactful, and it might take even 2 before you start really getting back to that kind of at-large cut line at this point.
And I don't think that there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. I think it's just important to understand how it works,
Yeah.
to, kind of look at this kind of example of how these two kind of different resumes got to the same point, and kind of the implications then of how some of these dial settings work, particularly as it relates to the minimum wins, kind of what we're going to require to stay on your resume. And again, I think just kind of generally philosophically speaking, I like that there is some sort of path for just about anyone, right? Over the summer, when we did a series of videos on different NPI topics, one of them was, does NPI give everyone a chance, right? So we looked at what, like, absolute worst strength of schedule. Was there a path that those teams could have taken to have gotten kind of near that cut line for an at-large bid? And what we found was, yeah, kind of. I mean, it kind of depends on maybe only losing in your conference championship game and a favorable bid thief scenario. But I think for me, philosophically, I think that's good that there's not just, oh, we have this schedule and there is absolutely no path. There's no possible way we could
Yeah.
win enough games. Our only access would be through an automatic bid. But you mentioned it. That doesn't mean that you can play a terrible schedule and then lose even 2 games maybe. It's
Yeah.
it's it's setting up that margin for error.
Yep.
It's the other side of the coin of, oh, we're gonna play a bunch of tough teams, but we're gonna lose them all, and then we're gonna be okay because we've got a strong strength of schedule.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're playing in a conference that doesn't offer you the strength in the league, then you probably need to go out of league in those, whatever it is, 9, 10, 11 games you can control. And you need to go out and get quality games in those. And you need to win a good bunch. If you're a league that does offer a lot of quality, a lot of other teams that are winning a bunch of their non-conference games, you either don't have to go out and schedule as difficult in the non-conference, or you have more margin for error to schedule those games and take a couple of losses because you have opportunities to make up for those. So I agree. I like that there's 2 different paths. I like that we can sit here and say Endicott with a really good win at Tufts and then a handful of other pretty good wins and only 1 loss can look pretty similar to an Illinois Wesleyan that's gone out and played some nationally elite teams, suffered a few losses, plays in a tough conference, and here we are, 3 weeks out from the tournament, they're almost at the exact same number. I think that's an interesting system.
Well, and you talk about how your conference dynamics set up what you have to do or should do in your non-conference, and you even see that here, where look at the games that are beyond the minimum win style for Illinois Wesleyan. They're mostly non-conference games because they do have some very strong non-conference games, but playing a CCIW schedule is going to provide quite a bit of rigor. You look at on the Endicott side and what's being kind of excluded from being required to be counted because it would drag their NPI down, right? You got 2 games against Curry, you got Johnson and Wales, you got 2 games against Wentworth, right? 5 of those are conference games that are just on their schedule because of the conference they're in, right? Now you could say it'd be nice to see a team like Endicott go out and maybe play a game better than John Jay and their non-conference opponent, right? So there's room to maybe dial that up, but I think it's part of the discussion to understand the history of how maybe this came about is to avoid a scenario that we saw sometimes in the previous system where you play a game that you're required to play because it's a conference opponent, you win that game, but that team is so bad that it tanks your SOS, and so you come out of that game, a game that you won that you should win, and you end up looking worse, right? So the NPI kind of fixes that problem to some extent, where yeah, we're going to make sure that you've got a solid batch of wins, but if there's some of those games that are going to lower your NPI that that we just expect you to win, then there is some provision for those to not be counted against you.
Yeah. Yeah.
NPI is interesting. It's a snapshot in time, though. Once a single game is played, the previous results go out the window. You got to run the whole thing, right? And so it's not so much about where it is or where it has been, but ultimately where it's going, right? Because the whole point of NPI is to be there at the end of the season to select and seed teams for the NCAA tournament. Obviously, to know exactly what's going to happen, we need to know how each and every game is going to play out down the stretch. But with the help of the D3 Datacast efficiency ratings and running 1,000 computer simulations, we can play through a bunch of the possibilities. Because every time a team step on the court, Team A could win, Team B could win. Now, if Team A is better than Team B, maybe Team A should win more often than Team B. But by using 1,000 different simulations, we can kind of gain some level of expectation for how things are more likely to play out or could play out. And so we do that on d3datacast.com. And we have this bubble watch view to try to build in some expectations of who are going to be the really strong contenders to be in that at-large position when the season comes to a conclusion heading into the into the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, this is something we run every day on d3datacast.com. And it's my favorite kind of quick look at what the pecking order is for kind of the bubble watch. And we put them into these kind of broad buckets, locks and near locks, teams that are showing up in basically every simulation as making the tournament. And these are at-large percentages in simulations in which they did not win their AQ. So this is just looking at getting into that at-large, what we call Pool C picture for the NCAA tournament. We've got about 10 teams that look like they've locked it up or just about locked it up. They either there was never a simulation in which they lost enough games to knock them out of the tournament. And then we've got a big group of teams that we call solid, kind of between 75 and almost 100%, where they're getting in most of the time. And right now, those two groups make up 30 teams. So we have only 21 at-large spots, but we have 30 teams that say they're 75% or better. A bunch of these teams will win their conferences, so that will they'll win the AQ, so they'll be off this list at some point. So typically our cut line falls between that bubble in and bubble out, kind of the two smallest groups here. That's usually where the cut line ends up. So somewhere between Johns Hopkins and Rhodes, maybe you can expect to be where the line ends up. And these teams will still jockey for a lot of position, right? As you lose a game, you kind of will fall several spots in this list. If you win an unexpected game, you could maybe rocket up a little bit. But you can almost think of these as buckets, right? Who will make the tournament? Probably all those teams on that locks list will make the tournament. Maybe like how many? There's 20 on the solid list. Probably the computer expects maybe 17 of those teams will actually end up making the tournament. Maybe 1 to 3 will not. Even as far on to the right side is probably out. At this point in the year, maybe one of those teams on that list does find their way to getting an at-large. So it'll be interesting to see. Someone could still go on a run. Virginia Wesleyan, if they win a bunch of ODAC games, maybe they end up in the kind of bubble picture. Who's to say?
We put this on the slide. This is as of Sunday morning, right? So we have already results Sunday that are going to change this picture. And so that's why we're not giving too much time to digging into this. And it's going to change every day. But d3datacast.com, we have the NPI, rest of season projections. The simulations are updated there every day, along with the current NPI rankings based just on games played to date. It's going to change, so it's not worth putting too much time into or like really diving into it. But it's something definitely to watch. It's been a really fun tool to develop, last season and watch. And I think as we watched it, I know we were even reviewing kind of how things looked the middle of February last year, and by the time you take out the teams that did eventually win their automatic qualifier, like it really seemed to validate the quality of the projection, right? I mean, nothing is locked in, and it's all about teams ultimately performing, you know, up to expectation, and not everyone will. Uh, but really, I think this gives a pretty good view that, for fans who are going to be interested in that bubble situation, going to be interested in who's going to be getting those at large bids. I think that this is going to be a really really great tool to reference on a daily basis.
One interesting team to watch in vis-a-vis Sunday results is Brandeis, who entered at almost 90% on Sunday. I think our computer said they almost always made it if they just got two more wins. They lost to Case Western Reserve. That was a road game for them, but that was one of maybe their better opportunities to secure a win. They've got a really tough schedule ahead at Emory, at Rochester, home Chicago, home Wash U, at NYU. If you get two wins there, you're doing pretty well. They're going to need two wins somewhere. Probably Mondays, they'll be right around that 75% line, so maybe still looking pretty good. But they're really going to have to kind of walk a line between the tough UAA schedule to stay on that good side. Their easiest opponent, quote unquote, is Rochester, but that's a road game, so they're going to have to steal some wins. Otherwise, things are going to get dicey there for Brandeis.
Matt, it's a good time to plug another resource that's available at d3datacast.com, and that's the daily score predictions page, in which you've also included a game leverage number. And so you want to talk about that again? I know we've talked about it on the show, we've referenced it, but just in this context, I think it's another good time to mention that it's there and how fans can use it.
Yeah, if you go to the top link bar and you go to predictions, there's men's basketball and women's basketball, and that's that day's games. What our computer efficiency ratings would predict, either the score and the win probability for each team. Also included in there is the game leverage, and that is the difference in that team's total tournament odds, so AQ plus at large, of between if they won that game and lost that game. So I was just talking about Brandeis, their game.
They were 14% was showing what their leverage number was for this game.
Yeah, leverage of 14%. Almost all of that was probably at large bid potential. So 14 taken out of 89, that's right about 75. That's probably where they'll come in the next day. So their difference between winning and losing, well, I guess some of it's on the positive side. So they won that game, they probably jumped up to 95 or something like that. They lose, they're going to be probably somewhere 75, 80%. So that's an interesting thing to see, is how important is that game to that team's simulation odds. If you see a team that's at 30% and they lose a 30% game, then that's pretty bad for them. Toward the end of the season, we'll start seeing these games kind of be like 100-0. Like either you win or you lose and you're out, right?
And to just draw another comparison there, we saw an epic game between Chicago and Emory, but you look at that and, zeros across the board in terms of leverage, right? They're two teams that are just in good enough position. It didn't matter in terms of getting in or not getting in at this point, and probably maybe at this point, any point, for who won that game. These are two teams that
they're going to
just
get
look like they're tournament locks, right? So from that perspective, you don't see anything show up in terms of leverage. It's a big game, it's an important game, it's an exciting game, big implications for the UAA race. But in terms of the likelihood of either of these teams getting into the tournament, doesn't move the needle.
Yep.
All right, Matt. Let's a lot goes into that. Ultimately, it's about how you perform against your schedule, but any schedule maybe can get you there, but it's going to present you with different levels of margin for error. And so we've developed a little bit of a program to help give some informed guidance to coaches as they put schedule together. We talk a lot about, the importance of NPI for getting into the tournament, but really it's to every team's benefit and every conference's benefit for every team to look as good in NPI as possible. And so, really a tool for programs that can be in position for a tournament, or just because, they want to do right by their conference and play the right kind of games for the level they're at. We have the D3 Datacast concierge program that we can provide program specific guidance based on all of the things we've talked about, right? What does it mean for your program to play the right kind of schedule? d3datacast.com/concierge, how you can sign up for that program. We're in kind of a pre-registration period right now for 2026. The kind of cornerstone of that program is a customized report that gives kind of a conference level analysis of what a program can expect to receive in terms of NPI potential from their league, and then based on that, kind of some guidance on, well, what does that mean your non-conference schedule should look like, and based on that, who are some of the programs you should be looking to schedule in non-conference play. That's again in pre-registration, because it's based on the final D3 Datacast efficiency ratings and the final NPI rankings, which are both pending at this point. But the plan for everyone who can pre-register for that program is to provide a preliminary report at the end of the regular season once those NPI numbers are locked, and then at the end of the tournament when the final efficiency ratings numbers are locked, to provide a final report. Coaches can use that as program specific guidance as they're looking to maybe finish out a schedule for next year, start looking ahead for the year beyond.
Yeah, we've been happy to talk to several coaches, so looking to add more.
All right, let's talk about the picks. Last week, Matt, Whitman was 21-point underdogs in the rivalry game at Whitworth, and I tell you what, Whitworth had that game covered at halftime. It was an 80-46 win for the Pirates, despite the fact that I went to bed at halftime of that one, Matt, and I had a dream over the course of the night that Whitman came back to send that game into overtime, but that Whitworth had outscored them 12-0 in overtime. Of course, that was just my dream. I woke up the next morning to check the actual final score, and Whitworth did not give back any of that final margin. Bates was another big underdog on the road at Trinity, Connecticut. They were able to cover the 20-point spread, but fell short of the win against the Bantams. That was an 88-77 win. We talked about that big road game at Trinity, Texas. Not only did they come within the 4.5 computer number there, but they get the 76-75 win outright. Montclair State, 5-point favorites on the road at Stockton, and they blew that out of the water, 104-73, easily getting the win and covering that number. And in the D3 Datacast game of the week, Mary Washington was 10.5-point underdogs at Randolph-Macon. And the game may not have been in doubt, but which side was going to be the winner in this game definitely was down the stretch, as it seemed like that game was being played out with fouls and things like that. Not necessarily to get the win, but it seemed to be hovering right around that 10.5 number. Randolph-Macon gets the 11-point victory there. Total it all up, Matt. It was a 2-3 week for me, 33, 34, and 2 on the year. 2-3 doesn't look good, but it looks better than your 1-4 for a second consecutive week. But you still have the far superior overall number at 40, 27, and 2.
It's been a string of rough weeks for me. The kids would say that I am selling, Zach.
You are, yes. The kids would say that.
All right, let's look at this week. Game number 1 out in the NCAC. 2 in the kind of lead, the big lead group out there is DePaul, 2-point underdogs at Denison. Zach, your pick.
I'm going to go with Denison. That's an NCAC picture that, was tight, and maybe Denison looked like they had emerged as a little bit of a favorite. It's tight again, but just 2 points there. Denison at home in what's maybe a little bit of a tightening race. I don't know. I'd say desperation for the Big Red there in the NCAC race, but just a 2-point home favorite. I will take Denison.
Yeah, with a big group in DePaul a little bit behind there. They're going to have to – these games are important, right? So I'm going to go with DePaul. I think that they can I'm going to basically say they're going to win outright if it's only a 2-point line, but it's going to be a close one. I'm going to take the Tigers there. Out in New York State, we have Cortland, 1-point favorites, on the road at Oswego State. Zachary.
Well, in our way too early conference champion draft, Oswego State was one of my picks out of the SUNYAC there. So I feel like I got to stick with them in an important SUNYAC game. 1-point home underdog. Give me the Lakers.
Okay. Zach, I'm going to go with Cortland. I've been liking Cortland a lot this year. I think they're looking strong in that conference. Tough to pick a road favorite here to cover, but if they can win this by even a full basket, then I will get the point there. Going out to the MASCAC for Salem State and Worcester State. Worcester State are 4-point favorites at home.
Yeah, this is a big one in the MASCAC race behind Westfield State. Give me Worcester State. I think they're the best of that chase pack there. They're going to need this one to keep pace.
Yeah, Zach, I'm going to also go with Worcester State. I think this will be pretty close to a 4-point line. Sounds pretty good to me, but I'm going to say that the Lancers can cover that one. Okay, big one out in the Arc, Nebraska Wesleyan, 5-point dogs on the road at Loris. Zach, your pick.
I'd feel better about this one at Snyder Arena, but it's not 5 points to work with here. Still, I'll go with Nebraska Wesleyan.
All right, Zach, I will too. 5 just seems pretty big. I think these teams feel pretty close. So I will just take the 5 points to cover and hope for a fun game. D3 Datacast game of the week out in a Centennial Conference seems to have big implications there. Franklin and Marshall, 6.5-point underdogs at Johns Hopkins. Zach, your pick.
Yeah, it feels like it's not a huge number at 6.5, but it starts to feel a little bit bigger than maybe it should be. And what could be seems on paper to me a little bit more of a coin flip type game. So I'll take the 6.5 with the Diplomats.
Yeah, Zach, for me, same pick for the same reason. The computer sees some separation in these two teams that I don't necessarily view as maybe quite there. So I would see this line as more like 3.5 for a home game for Johns Hopkins. 6.5 feels like I'm getting 3 points for free. So I will go with F&M to cover that one.
All right, we have one more pick, Matt. We need to pick up from a postponed game on our pick slate a couple weeks ago. That was Hardin Simmons at Mary Hardin Baylor has been rescheduled for February 10th. So we're gonna repick that with an updated line, which is okay. Hardin Simmons getting 5.5 at Mary Hardin Baylor. They'll play twice this week because of the reschedule, but we are picking the game that is rescheduled to February 10th.
Okay, it's at Mary Hardin Baylor.
Correct.
I will take Mary Hardin Baylor. What was that, 5.5?
Yes.
I will take Mary Hardin Baylor to cover the 5.5 at home.
Okay, I will take the 5.5
Okay.
with Hardin Simmons.
All right. You have to remember that we picked this.
Yes, we'll add it to the
recap.
To the recap for next week and add it to the season-long record. All right, let's finish up with a mailbag segment here. Matt from Graham Dunwoody at Graham Dcasts on Twitter X. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, roll a random number 1 through 408, go to your efficiency ratings, and talk about the team whose ranking is the number you rolled for a minute. Are you ready to roll? I've got a random number generator up here.
Okay, I hope it ends up at Calvin. You pick the number.
It is an even 100.
Ooh, okay. The number 100 team is St. John's out of the MIAC.
St. John's out of the MIAC.
Yeah.
Okay, so it didn't say we each had to do this, right? So I imagine we can combine to be able to talk about St. John's for 1 minute, which shouldn't be difficult, Matt. St. John's, it was a really interesting team coming into the season because what did they have? Like 8 of their top 9 were seniors a year ago. Completely, like about as new of a team as you could have. Of course, we see completely new teams all the time in Division One, but this is kind of the old school. We're graduating everyone. So you don't really know kind of what we're going to get from St. John's being a completely new roster. So it's kind of interesting, right? Because St. John's is an established program, a well-known program, and so it just kind of tests that theory that you can plug in kind of like program level, replacement level, and that's kind of what you expect as like a baseline from any program, right?
Yeah. Well, and the MIAC is not a conference that runs super deep all the time, right? It's a little bit maybe like the MIAA, more teams than the MIAA, but you have a handful of really good programs at the top that tend to be the same types of teams year in and year out, and then maybe there's a middle group, and then maybe some of the similar teams at the bottom. St. John's feels like they're not ever the teams at the bottom. We didn't know this year would they be able to plug their new group of rotation players in right away and be at the top of the conference. Of course, Gustavus Adolphus has been so good that they've not been able to do that, but they've been pretty good. I think they're kind of in that, like, I think there's like a group that's kind of in the chase for third that St. John's is in right now. And they've been above 500 in that conference. They've been overall strong, not with the level they'd been the last maybe 2-3 years. But again, 7 or 8 rotation guys are gone, and we knew that things were going to be different. So I think they've been good. Probably expect them to be the start of maybe a new build. We'll be honest, I don't know their complete roster construction as of right now, but I assume it's younger given how old they were last year. But they've been solid. They've been good.
And maybe the kind of season that Gustavus has had is you kind of liken it to Whitworth in the Northwest Conference, where they've kind of been like the obvious number one in that conference. And so that's, maybe made you pay a little bit less attention to the conference race, the conference dynamics overall. But we often talk about top 100 being kind of a
Yeah.
baseline kind of proxy for who's good, right? Because it's
Yeah.
kind of like the top quartile. Not that there aren't good teams necessarily beyond 100, but again, talking about just having a kind of complete replacement from a production level from a year ago, and there's St. John's still, in that good category, which is
Yeah.
what you expect from a program like St. John's.
Yeah. I don't know where they are in NPI, but that's basically the end of quad one in kind of efficiency rating standpoint. If you think of like how good is the wins, they're still a strong program, a team that could probably play with anyone in the country, even if ultimately they don't win a whole bunch of those games this season.
All right, so that actually turned out better than I was hoping for,
Okay.
right?
That was
That was
pretty
that
good.
was way over a minute, I think.
Happens to be a team we saw in person last year, so that was good.
Right, right, and yeah, that was a pretty obvious narrative or talking point coming into the season. All right, one more here to wrap up this week's mailbag from Max Fan at Go Maccabees on Twitter X. This came in as a message a couple weeks ago. We weren't able to pick it up in time, but wanted to now. Just kind of talking about. I clipped this a little bit to fit on our graphic, but kind of talking how Yeshiva's season kind of sets up an interesting maybe test case for NPI, and so the question is, how would Yeshiva's NPI change if they had won the following games sequentially versus Illinois Wesleyan, at Mary Washington, at Tufts, and versus Chapman? Seeing the NPI after each added win might be a good way to show how impactful specific games are. Of course, that's important because being in a conference like the Skyline, Yeshiva is not necessarily going to get a lot of real great NPI building games on their schedule, right? So to put together kind of the best possible NPI version of themselves, they're going to have to go out of conference and play a bunch of good games. And they kind of went above and beyond that, playing a lot of really tough games, and for a consecutive year, and that has led to a lot of losses, right? So they're getting all those wins in Skyline Conference, but as we talked about in the main topic, those aren't necessarily the kind of wins that are going to be building a strong tournament type resume. Right. So taking this kind of sequential approach, if they won this game, won this game, won this game, like kind of how that starts to build on each other in terms of how it adjusts how they look in NPI.
And these were all really close games. Like the Illinois Wesleyan game
Oh,
was
yeah.
a 1 point loss. The Mary Washington game was an overtime loss. And I think Tufts was overtime loss as well. So all games that could have gone either way. I think entering Sunday, I think we had them at number 102 with an NPI just above 56. If they had won the Illinois Wesleyan game, I think that bumps them up to number 70 with an NPI of 57.8. So that's still, outside the bubble picture. If they had also picked up the Mary Washington game in addition to the Illinois Wesleyan game, I would have had them at number 47 with an NPI just above 60. So there you're probably in like bubble out territory. So that's probably not quite putting you in there. And I say that because Skyline down the stretch, you're probably not adding a bunch of good wins that are going to push you over the edge. So that's probably bubble out or trending towards that. If they had picked up the Tufts game as well, I think that puts them to number 30, NPI 62.2. That's probably bubble in or higher territory. You wouldn't want to be taking any additional losses beyond that, but that's probably a good enough stable of games where you could probably find your way into the tournament. Again, I mean, you have to take the loss, so maybe that's even not. Maybe that's still bubble in, bubble out. I'm not quite sure, but it'd be starting to put you in the conversation right now, right? And then winning all of these, so adding the Chapman game as well. This would be number 16, NPI of 64.2. So that would be looking at, hey, do you want to maybe host? If you can then go through and win the Skyline tournament, win all the rest of their games, maybe you're top 16. But even if you don't, if you lost the Skyline tournament game, you're probably at that point in the tournament then. So this is what, and these are just the close games, right? The competitive games that they were in. This isn't the Trinity game or the Wesleyan game where they got kind of beat pretty bad. Some of these good opponents that they played toe-to-toe with and that they couldn't quite win.
Yep. So, I mean, it all kind of goes back to that discussion about who you're playing, who you're beating, who you're losing to, right? Those are a bunch of games that, on an individual basis, that kind of loss isn't going to kill you, but you also can't just lose too many of those type of games, right? That's not really going to get you where you need to be. And then winning all those Skyline games also isn't really going to necessarily get you where you need to be, right? So it's that balance of playing the right games, winning the right kind of games, avoiding the wrong kind of losses. It all goes in together. All right, that wraps up this week's mailbag. You can find us on social media at D3 Datacast. If you have something for us to cover at the end of next week's show, you can leave a message on. If you're watching on YouTube, we can pick it up there. Lots of ways to get a hold of us if you've got something for next week's mailbag.
Yep.
But as we wrap up, we're going to say thank you to our supporters at patreon.com/D3 Datacast. These are the people that partner with us to support our efforts financially. D3Datacast.com. We've talked about all that's there for fans to follow what's going on. It's there ad free, no paywall. Right, this is there for everyone to enjoy without any sort of ads or anything else encumbering their experience. It's thanks to our supporters here that make that happen. Put out this show every week. We have a lot of fun doing it, and just are very blessed to have received a lot of great feedback and a lot of people who find the value in it and are willing to support us as a result.
Thanks for the support, everyone. Good job, team.